a few housekeeping matters. We will be muting everyone, so please remain muted so that others are not accidentally disturbed. If you have any questions after the presentation, please send them using the chat facility to everyone. We shall try to read out the questions, so please keep the questions brief. We may need to précis or paraphrase the questions, and we may be able to amalgamate or consolidate some of the questions. The presentation this evening is already being recorded, but the questions will not be recorded. The recording will be made available on YouTube sometime after the end of the festival. Now, using Zoom does have some advantages, that participants and the audience can be in different parts of the country. Caitlin Greenwood, the Heritage Development Officer at the Folly, is hosting this event, but she is not in Settle. Instead, she's further north near Hadrian's Wall. And Felicity Cobbing, our speaker this evening, is in the southeast of the country. And I'm in lovely Malhamdale, just about 5 miles away from Walter Morrison's mountain home of Malham Tarn House. Now, this is the third lecture to the Festival Autumn series of talks about the life and times of Walter Morrison. And we know that Walter Morrison was a man of many parts. So before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to read a brief extract from the Malhamdale magazine published in January 1922, so in the month following Walter's death. And it was written by Reverend Barron, the vicar of Kirkby Malham Parish Church, who led Walter's funeral service. And it says, "What a man he was. London knew him as a great financier. South America knew him as a man of business who could bring order out of chaos. Palestine knew him as an ardent student of archaeology." Well, tonight we shall be learning about Palestine and the Palestine Exploration Fund. And it's my privilege to introduce the expert, Felicity Cobbing. Now, Felicity is a professional archaeologist. After graduating from Bristol University, she worked at the British Museum and she volunteered at the PEF. She made herself so essential that when the PEF decided that it needed a curator, Felicity was the obvious choice. And now, as well as being curator of the PEF's collection of more than 50,000 items, Felicity is also chief executive of the PEF. And in her spare time, she leads cultural tours in Jordan, where she has also conducted excavations. This evening, the title of her talk is From Traveller's Tales to Triangulation, the Palestine Exploration Fund in the Holy Land. So would you please welcome Felicity Cobbing? Thank you.
There we go. Can everyone hear me? Thank you, Colin, for that kind introduction. I'll crack on with the lecture. Excuse me if I sometimes cough. I've been suffering, I'm afraid, from seasonal lurgies. Not the big one, fortunately, but irritating nonetheless. So, in this talk, I will be concentrating on the early history of the Palestine Exploration Fund, when it was the first society of its kind to be active in the field, and of which Walter Morrison was the honorary treasurer for, I think, around 54 years, which is quite extraordinary. Established in 1865, the PEF was the first Western learned society devoted to the study of the southern Levant, with the physical characteristics of the area, the landscapes, the climate, the ancient remains as its focus, as opposed to the biblical and textual studies. The area of focus was at the time a part of the aging Ottoman Empire and constitutes modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and southern Syria, with interests also in Sinai and Cyprus. Soon after its establishment, the American Palestine Exploration Society, or APES, as we like to call them, was established in 1870, supposedly modelled on the PEF. However, it lacked the rigour of the British institution and fizzled out after about 5 years or so. But in the 1880s and 1890s, other institutions started to take root and flourish, such as the French École Biblique and the German Deutsche Palästina Verein. An American presence was finally established in Jerusalem in 1900 with the American Schools of Oriental Research, and soon after, several American universities, including Harvard, Pennsylvania, and Chicago's Oriental Institute, became increasingly active in the field and remain so to this day. In the Mandate period following the First World War, British activity also increased with the founding of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, the BSAJ for short, with the backing of the British Museum and the PEF, and the establishment of the Department of Antiquity of the Mandatory Government of Palestine. That's just a nice watercolour. The British Mandate was a golden age for international archaeological exploration, and with so many active players, collaborations became very frequent. For example, the excavations at Samaria in the 1920s and 30s were carried out by the BSAJ, the Hebrew University, Harvard University, and the PEF. But for the first crucial years, the PEF stands more or less alone in the field, and as such holds a unique place in the history of the development of academic study in the region, particularly with regards to archaeology and historical geography. This is not to say that no one had travelled there or studied the region, far from it, but these travels into what was an inaccessible and sometimes dangerous region had tended to be individual enterprises with personal motivations and producing accounts of varying reliability. Consequently, the whole of the region was something of a terra incognita to Westerners, and many Western powers, particularly Britain, Germany, and France, were very interested in gathering useful information about this strategically significant corner of the world. In particular, with the Ottoman Empire weakening, they were concerned that Russia should not get too strong a foothold in the region. There was a powerful cultural incentive to boot, which was perhaps more relevant to the individual than to governments. As the birthplace of both Judaism and Christianity, and a center of the Islamic world, the land of the Bible, the Holy Land, with the holy city of Jerusalem at its heart, was seen by many as key to their religious belief. To know the land would be to understand the book and would be a return to the spiritual home, so to speak. This element of intellectual and spiritual pilgrimage, of going back to the roots of Christian religion, is important in understanding the motivations of some of those joining the PEF. This was a time when many Britons saw themselves as God's chosen people. And as such, they felt a duty to study and explore this part of the world for the benefit of all mankind. Additionally, British strategic interests, which increasingly included the social movement of Zionism in the latter decades of the 19th century, was also a powerful incentive for some members, some of whom were highly influential in the corridors of power. The PEF's work was undeniably useful to the British government and was central to the Zionist movement's progress in terms of information gathering about the land of Palestine and the shaping of opinion as to its supposed ripeness for such a colonial exercise. Whilst the PEF as an organisation stayed apart from social and political issues, its members sometimes held very strong views about the state of Palestine, which were sometimes republished in the pages of the PEF's journal, the Quarterly Statement. Key PEF figures like Charles Warren and Claude Conder, whose watercolour this is, and who we will hear about later, were strong advocates for Zionism as a mechanism for regenerating what they observed as an exhausted and decadent society in Palestine, with vigorous newcomers with strong cultural connections to both Palestine and the West. However, even for those people who did not have a strong faith or a strong ideological interest, the cultural debt the West owed the Levant was self-evident, and understanding better the reality of this cultural heritage was a powerful factor. I think it's also really important not to underestimate curiosity and discovery, whether in a specific scientific field or through exploration in general, as a powerful incentive in undertaking a venture of this sort. For example, David Livingstone was nominally a missionary, but only managed to successfully convert one African to Christianity through all his long years on the continent. But there is no doubt that he was one of the era's most successful explorers and geographers. I get the impression that it was the exploring rather than the proselytizing which really interested him. As a founding member of the PEF and its treasurer from 1866 to 1919, Walter Morrison played an essential role in the organization in what was its most productive and influential phase. It's fair to say that without his input, the PEF would not have been able to achieve what it did and would have disappeared a long time ago. The PEF's finances were always strained, and Morrison's careful management was key to ensuring its survival. And then it was by the, absolute seat of their pants, it really was. He expected excellent money management from the explorers themselves and was sometimes highly critical of those who didn't submit regular accounts. However, he was also generous with his own money, making frequent donations to specific projects, and most significantly for the PEF, purchasing a property for us at 2 Hine Street in Marylebone in 1911. This gift meant that the PEF had a permanent home for the first time since it was founded in 1865. Prior to this, it had moved several times, which must have been an absolute nightmare, given that a large quantity of archival and archaeological material in our collections had already been acquired in these years. It also meant we had an asset of considerable value. Initially, we occupied the whole building and used it as a venue for exhibitions, but in more recent years, the building was used to supplement its finances from subscriptions and donations through commercial letting, which meant our own premises were reduced to the rather grotty cellars at 2 Hind Mews, which you can see here. Very grotty indeed, very, very cramped, impossible to manage as an archive, as a collection. Really, really hard work, quite depressing to work in. It may have meant that the society stayed afloat, but the storage conditions for our collections were pretty dire, and something needed to be done, and I'm absolutely sure Walter would have agreed. So in 2018, we managed to move. We were able to sell the property and purchase a purpose-designed space on the Thames riverfront in Greenwich, a short distance away from the World Heritage Site of Maritime Greenwich, which is just fabulous. And I encourage you to visit anytime you get down there. It's a gorgeous part of London to be in. The remaining funds are enough that with careful investment, our long-term survival is secure, which is fantastic. As well as the traditional pilgrimages undertaken since the Middle Ages, many studies predating the PEF had been carried out in Palestine. The Napoleonic campaigns of 1798 to 1801 had been accompanied by a substantial cartographic and recording project, which had a huge impact on the Western world's knowledge of the region, particularly Egypt, of course. Following this were scholars such as the Frenchman Félicien de Saussy and the Comte de Vogüé, who wrote extensively and expertly on the architectural treasures of the region. Then there's the famous Swiss explorer Burckhardt, who rediscovered Petra for the West in 1812, and the American Reverend excuse me, Edward Robinson in the 1830s, who developed the subject of historical geography. Robinson looked into the traditional identifications of biblical sites, so-called, and concluded that some of them were indeed plausible, but many were little more than wishful thinking. Later, various geographical surveys of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean coast of the Levant were carried out by British and American naval officers. An important map of the Holy Land was produced by Lieutenant van der Velde of the Dutch Navy in the 1850s and 60s. However, despite these important studies, much of the work compiled over the centuries was less than rigorous in its scientific approach, often being linked to religious pilgrimage or adventure writing. When the scholarship was good, these tended to be isolated pieces of research floating in a sea of dubious accounts. In 1864, the lack of a proper water supply for Jerusalem was a matter of concern in some influential quarters in Great Britain. In the previous decade, John Snow had identified the link between diseases such as cholera and the water supply, and this had eventually led to the development of clean water and sewerage systems in the UK, Europe, and America. Clean water for the Holy City was something of a rallying call, but before any water supply could be installed, a survey of the city itself needed to be undertaken. George Grove, perhaps best known as the founder of the Royal College of Music and the author of Grove's Dictionary of Music, was a civil engineer who was at the same time running the Crystal Palace in South London. He was also a very accomplished Hebrew scholar with a direct interest in the study of the Holy City. And he persuaded Baroness Angela Burdett Coutts, an influential philanthropist from the famous banking family, to put £500 towards this. A survey of Jerusalem and its environs was commissioned and was carried out in 1864 to 5 by the Ordnance Survey under the direction of Captain Charles Wilson of the Royal Engineers, who was, incidentally, a friend of George Grove's. It included an accurate plan of Jerusalem, plans of the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and other important buildings, and a survey of the countryside surrounding the city. Captain Wilson also ran a series of levels running from Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast, over the Judean hills up to Jerusalem, and down to the north shore of the Dead Sea. This series of levels established for the first time the absolute elevations of Jerusalem and the Dead Sea in relation to sea level, the latter being some 1,300 feet below the Mediterranean. The mark on the shores of the Dead Sea made by the Ordnance Survey team was subsequently used by the PEF for regular measurements of the water level and is now known as the PEF mark. The plans and report of Jerusalem were published together with an album of really superb large format photographs taken by Sergeant MacDonald, some of them you see here. These photographs provide an invaluable historical record, as well as being some of the finest photographs ever taken of this most photographed of cities. The public success of the Ordnance Survey led directly to the founding of the Palestine Exploration Fund in 1865. The PEF, or fund, as it is often referred to, was the idea of Dean Arthur Stanley of Westminster, this chap here, who was a very high-ranking and influential churchman, and his friend George Grove, both of whom had previously studied to Palestine and contributed an important scholarly work to the study of the region. Stanley's volumes Sinai and Palestine, first published in 1856, ran to several editions and was very widely read. George Grove contributed a vocabulary of Hebrew topographical words to this volume, as well as writing several articles on similar subjects for Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, first published in 1863. So the scene was set for the new society. The Ordnance Survey had finally got public interest up to a level where this pipe dream of George Grove and Dean Arthur Stanley's could become a reality. And at a public meeting, the governing principles and aims of the new society were outlined. These were that whatsoever was undertaken should be carried out on scientific principles, that the society should, as a body, abstain from controversy, easier said than done, that it should not be started nor conducted as a religious society, The subjects which the fund would concern itself were as follows: archaeology, topography, geology, the natural sciences of botany, zoology, and meteorology, and the manners and customs of existing populations, what would now be termed anthropology or ethnography. In the inaugural address, the chairman, the Archbishop of York, admitted that the disparate interests of the members of the new society made it imperative that these scientific principles were rigorously adhered to, otherwise the members would end up tearing each other's throats out. It is a mark of the PEF's broad appeal at the time that many individuals who would not otherwise be seen dead sharing a seat in the same organization were prepared to put up with their considerable differences when it came to the PEF. For example, astonishingly, the famous naturalist and evolutionary theorist Thomas Huxley shared a seat on the founding committee of the PEF alongside his two arch rivals on the battleground between traditional biblical interpretation and evolutionary theory, Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, and Professor Richard Owen, founder of the Natural History Museum. Huxley was a close personal friend of Dean Arthur Stanley, and the spirit of exploration and recent scientific advances were as much a part of the PEF's early ethic as were the biblical traditions, landscapes, and sites they were investigating. The membership included clergymen, scientists, social reformers, military men, and politicians. Whilst many undoubtedly joined the PEF with strong religious convictions, others were agnostic or even atheist. All, however, recognized the cultural debt which Western civilization owed the Levant, the lack of understanding of the region which at the time existed, and the need to work together to gather reliable information. So, though some had clerical backgrounds and biblical interests, they were often among the most forward-thinking of their generation. Whilst the world was still very much God's world, and by association Britain's world, they moved in circles associated more with the overturning of long-held wisdoms than with the preservation of the old ways. These lofty and exacting standards were what marked the PEF out from previous explorations, and indeed from many subsequently founded organizations. The PEF aimed to raise money from donations and subscriptions for the various projects it had in mind. Ultimately, it was the goal to map the entire country from Tyre in the north to the border with Egypt in the south, with a thorough description of every physical aspect of the country as covered by the new society's areas of interest. This ambitious project would wait a few years while the PEF got some practical experience managing such things. The first project was a preliminary reconnaissance from Palestine, from Baalbek in the north to Jerusalem in the south, carried out by a team of Royal Engineers consisting of Captain Charles Wilson and Lieutenant Stuart Anderson, with Corporal Henry Phillips as the photographer. The object of the survey was to identify suitable areas for future study and to lay the groundwork for the mapping of the region. The surveyors also studied a number of visible archaeological sites across the whole country, producing 50 drawn plans and the recording of inscriptions. The work on this expedition and others was conducted in extremely difficult conditions, including extremes of weather, the threat of disease, carrying heavy equipment across punishing terrain with obstinate donkeys and various other obstacles that the region tended to throw up at every turn. The dogged bravery, or some would say stupidity, of the men who carried out these pioneering studies should not be underestimated. We will be looking at some instance in gory detail a little bit later on. The next PEF project, running from 1867 to the mid-1870, was a further study of the archaeology of Jerusalem, particularly that which was to be found in the tunnels and cisterns carved out of the rock on which the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, and the city was built. There were several questions regarding the site of the Solomonic and Herodian temples, the positions of the ancient walls and the gates of the city, the construction of the Dome of the Rock, the dating of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and so on, that it was felt could be answered by a thorough investigation. This expedition is probably the single most important investigation of Jerusalem's ancient past which has been carried out, setting the framework for all future archaeological study. Another young team of Royal Engineers was hired by the PEF, led by Lieutenant Charles Warren, together with Corporal Henry Birtles and the photographer Corporal Phillips. They were joined by a local workforce and were accompanied for a short time by a talented young artist, William Simpson, who was the foreign correspondent for the popular magazine, The Illustrated London News. Simpson had already acquired some fame for his scenes of the Crimean War, including the Charge of the Light Brigade. His watercolours of the expedition in Jerusalem convey much of the danger and drama of the work being carried out. And I should mention that our collection of Simpsons is down again, once again, to Walter Morrison, who bought them at auction for us. As well as investigating Jerusalem's hidden history, the engineers continued the survey work begun by Wilson's expedition, covering the Mount Hermon region, Samaria, the plain of Philistia, the Judean desert, the Jordan Valley, and even Transjordan, which was a really wild and woolly place to visit in those days. These trips added significantly to our knowledge of the region, producing the most detailed study of Roman temples on Mount Hermon, the first reliable map of Transjordan, that's modern day Jordan basically, and measured plans from the ruins of Jerash and Philadelphia, modern Amman. Warren also demonstrated the man-made origin of the tells of the Jordan Valley. These are mounds which were previously believed to be natural features of the landscape. Warren could now confidently say that the tells at Jericho, Bethshan, Megiddo, and many others were in reality the remains of ancient settlements of some description. The significance of this was the recognition of an archaeological landscape that had previously gone unnoticed and has been the focus of much of the archaeological research in the region ever since. And I should say that there are tells all over the region, not just in the Jordan Valley. It's just that they're very obvious in that location because, of course, it's an alluvial plain, and so they are very distinctive. Up in the hills, they're sometimes less obvious to the naked eye, as it were. From the outset, the Warren expedition was fraught with difficulties. On his departure from London, Charles was given a small sum of money by the fund to get him on his way, or so he thought. In reality, this money was all that the PEF had to give him. Warren ended up by substituting substantially the project, subsidizing the project out of his own pocket to the tune of over £1,000, a considerable sum of money in those days. He would write to the PEF's committee in London asking for more funds. "Give us some results and we will send you funds," they said to him. "Give me money and I will send you results," was his reply. And I think we can all kind of sympathize with that. Relations with the officials and inhabitants of Palestine and Jerusalem had to be carefully nurtured, particularly with regards to his activities around the Haram al-Sharif, also known as the Temple Mount. The fund was immensely fortunate that Warren was a natural diplomat, a skill which gave him and his team greater access to the Haram than has been allowed ever since. However, things didn't always go according to plan. Though the PEF's firman from Constantinople granted Warren permission to explore the monument, the local pasha was extremely reticent, and perhaps not without due cause. The very act of digging so close to so many holy places for all the three religions caused a great deal of anxiety in many people, including the men who were employed to do the work. At one point in the expedition, Henry Phillips and his bulky camera equipment aroused the deep suspicion of some locals. He was accused of being an evil sorcerer, practicing black magic, and narrowly avoided confiscation of both his equipment and his life. At another point, Henry Birtles was briefly but very publicly arrested by the order of the Pasha. As one fellow adventurer in Palestine, John McGregor, wrote in the Times, "How would the Archbishop of Westminster react if the officers of the Ottoman army took up camp and started to dig holes around the lawn of the Abbey?" In addition to endless problems with funds and public relations, the members of the expedition had to contend with the great physical hardship and danger. All of them suffered at some point from fever. Palestine in the 19th century was a rundown backwater of the Ottoman Empire, and consequently the living conditions for both the explorer and the local inhabitants were often appalling. Extremes of temperature and various scourges and horrid creepy crawlies inflicted man and beast and made everyone, European and local, particularly vulnerable to disease. In his popular account of the expedition, Underground Jerusalem, published in 1876, Warren describes a great deal of the physical hardships he and his men encountered during the project, which ranged from the terrifying to the comic. And I quote a little excerpt here. "If Salah, my guide, could not get a rise out of me, the earwigs did. A colony settled in the lining of my helmet, where they must have led a very hot life. They would every now and then dart out of the holes along the edges of my helmet, take a peep into my eyes, and then, when I tried to brush them away, escape back again into the fort. They seemed so knowing about it and exhibited so much intelligence that they made me laugh frequently, much to Salah's amazement, who wanted to know if I understood what they said." Back in Jerusalem, the dangers were more to do with collapsing tunnels and falling masonry than the local wildlife. The nature of the expedition was to explore the underground structures of Jerusalem, which necessitated the digging of tunnels and shafts into the thousands of years of accumulated rubbish, loose building debris, and the underlying bedrock. An extremely hazardous job, and one not helped by the delays of supplies of wood and materials with which to build frames to shore up the tunnels. In Underground Jerusalem, Warren gives a vivid account of the dangers of this mining operation, in which he explains that the primary material through which they were driving their shafts and galleries were the stone chippings created by the stonemasons in the construction of the ancient monumental architecture under which they were tunneling. The material was not solid rock, but rather like a scree or gravel made up of small loose particles, and thus had very little cohesion to it. The resulting conditions for the excavations were, as you can imagine, highly dangerous, with tunnels liable to collapse at any moment. As Warren explains, should a frame break or a large stone, often 15 to 20 tons weight, get dislodged, there will be a general movement. The shaft will become skewed. The loose stones blow up through the bottom and sides, and in an instant, the whole world would become a wreck. Generally, the men knew by a trembling of the whole fabric a few seconds before this took place and got clear, but it was a very hazardous work and gave me great anxiety. It was not just the hazards of a mining operation that Warren and his men had to contend with, but the less than salubrious sewage arrangements of the Holy City. Warren describes with particular relish, it has to be said, one very memorable occasion. Near the Ecce Arch, there is a curious double rock-cut pool. At the south of this pool, which is now vaulted over, is a rock-cut passage, first observed by Major Wilson, but hitherto unexplored. I wonder why. It was then filled up with moist sewage, from 5 to 6 feet deep, so that if we had fallen in, there was no chance of our escaping with our lives. So what does he do? He goes exploring. Of course he does. He's Charles Warren. He and his trusty sidekick, Sergeant Birtles, they got a few old planks and made a very perilous voyage on the sewage to a bend from whence I could see a magnificent passage cut in the rock, 30 feet high. Finding the excessive danger of the planks, I procured 3 old doors and proceeded with Sergeant Birtles to our work. And here you can see this lovely little sketch of Warren and Birtles sewage surfing on 3 doors. Oh dear me. The 2 men proceeded along this route using the 3 doors as a moving walkway, taking the last of the 3 and placing it at the front as they proceeded, as this little sketch shows. Unfortunately for Warren and Birtles, the sewage acted in the same way as quicksand, sucking at the doors on the way on which they were standing. It goes to say that they had to be extremely careful during this exercise. Warren concludes his account with this chilling reminder of just how serious the situation could have been if things had gone wrong. Everything had now become so slippery with sewage that we had to exercise the greatest caution in lowering the doors and ourselves down, lest an unlucky false step might cause a header into the murky liquid, a fall which must have been fatal. And what honour would there have been in dying like a rat in a pool of sewage? My word. What Charles Warren and his team achieved in Jerusalem, never mind despite the sewage, or perhaps because of it, who knows, was nothing short of a miracle. Being excluded from digging on the Temple Mount itself, they sank a series of shafts up to 125 feet deep into the surrounded soil and then tunneled up to the walls of the ancient monument. I have to say, this is not what we would consider proper archaeological practice today. But it was a long time ago, and they were pioneers. By doing this, Warren was able to ascertain for the very first time the underlying topography around the site by finding the level of the natural bedrock beneath the centuries of debris. This process also revealed many features relating to Jerusalem's complex history along the way. He was also granted access to explore and survey the cisterns beneath the Temple Mount itself, so the first truly accurate plans of these caves and caverns was produced. By repeating the same methods he employed in the shafts, noting where the structures were built structures met natural rock, he was able to plot the levels of the natural underlying rock on which the Temple Mount itself was constructed. What this enabled Warren to produce was a contour map, not only of the area outside the Temple Mount, but inside as well, as you can see here in this plan here, and also here at the southern end of the Haram al-Sharif. All of these findings would have huge implications for our understanding of the Herodian Temple Mount and its later development, and for the archaeology of Jerusalem as a whole. Recent research on Warren's unpublished plans, descriptions and calculations now in the archives of the PEF have shown that in some ways he can be regarded as the first real archaeologist working in the Levant. He approached it from the perspective of an engineer and recorded with an engineer's eye for detail, accuracy and completeness. The results are such that one can tie the archaeological material that he recorded to the location, layer and level in which it was found. It would be another 20 years before Sir William Flinders Petrie, also working under the auspices of the PEF at Tel el-Hesi, would further develop the principles of stratigraphic excavation in the context of the archaeology of Palestine. As well as the popular account given in the hugely successful underground Jerusalem, the scholarly results of Wilson and Warren's work in Jerusalem were finally published in 1884 as one volume and one folio of plans in the 12 volumes of the PEF's seminal work, The Survey of Western Palestine, to which we will now turn our attention. In 1871, a further group of Royal Engineers, who presumably had not been told to what lengths they may be expected to go to in the pursuit of knowledge, were enlisted by the PEF to carry out the Survey of Western Palestine. This was a project of true ambition, encompassing the entire breadth of the PEF's brief. Not only was the country to be mapped, but it was to be investigated in every dimension relating to the brief that the PEF had set itself. As such, the final survey volume consists of one folio of the complete map, 26 map sheets map, in total at a scale of 1 inch to the mile, 3 memoirs dealing with the physical geography and archaeology of Palestine to accompany the maps, Warren's volume on Jerusalem, 1 volume respectively on the geology and the flora and fauna, 1 volume of comparative Hebrew and Arabic name lists, a volume of special papers covering topography, archaeology, and manners and customs, and a general index. In addition to the cartographical skills of the Royal Engineer, the renowned naturalist and evolutionist Canon Henry Tristram was commissioned to write the volume of Flora and Fauna, and the Professor of Geology at the Royal College of Science and Director of the Geological Survey of Ireland, Edward Hull, wrote the volume on the geology of the region. However, these studies were conducted after the other aspects of the survey had been completed. The initial team was led by the Captain Stewart of the Royal Engineers, with Sergeant Black, Corporal Armstrong as his assistants. Accompanying them in the capacity of Arabic scholar, interpreter, archaeologist, and naturalist was Charles Tewett Drake, the only civilian on the team. Accompanying the Europeans were 6 local assistants and an official from the Ottoman administration. The survey party began to work in the field in the November of 1871, whereupon Stewart almost immediately fell ill with fever and was ordered home. His replacement was the 25-year-old Lieutenant Claude Rainier Conder, and he is this chap here. This is Tewett Drake, and this is Sergeant Armstrong, and we think this is Corporal Black. Okay, but Conder didn't arrive until July 1872, and in the interim, Tewett Drake took control. Once he arrived, Conder took over command of the project. This was according to his contract with the PEF, but having been his own man for some time, Tewett Drake may not have appreciated this, and one gets the impression that the relationship between the two was sometimes a difficult one. Okay. There we go. Both Conder and Drake sent back regular reports on the progress of the mapping and the study of the archaeology to the PEF in London. As with earlier expeditions carried out by Wilson and Warren, these letters, reports, and preliminary plans and sketches form the basis of the PEF's own archives, which make it such a unique and valuable resource for many researchers. The survey teams transported themselves and their heavy equipment by means of 8 horses, 7 mules, and 6 camels for carrying the camping equipment. Campsites were chosen for all the usual reasons, but with the additional requirement that they provide a good base from which forays into the surrounding country could be made. Having selected their ideal spot, his team then had to convince the local sheikh that he would love to have them stay on his patch. As a bunch of Europeans in military dress, accompanied by an official of the Ottoman administration, this was not always easy. They often aroused suspicion and sometimes open hostility. In one episode, in July 1875, at the village of Safed in the Galilee, the survey party were greeted with a barrage of stone throwing, which resulted in 9 of them, including Conder, being very seriously injured. The survey was called off at this point, the team returning to Britain to recover. After exerting a considerable amount of pressure on the Ottoman administration, the instigators of the violence were charged and tried, and the town was fined £150 for its misdemeanor. The Safed incident represents the most extreme situation that the survey team found itself in, at least with regards to those caused by human beings, but acts of God were even less predictable and often more disastrous. As with Warren and Wilson before, the survey team had to endure extremes of temperature, violent weather conditions, earthquakes, and of course, there was the ever-present threat of illness. In the spring of 1874, a year before the Safed incident, Tewett Drake fell seriously ill with fever in Jericho and finally died in Jerusalem in early June, a tragedy which greatly affected all of the team, including Conder, who wrote, "I feel his loss very much now that I realize it." Drake's replacement was to be, as requested by Conder himself, a very young Lieutenant Royal Engineer by the name of Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Kitchener arrived in Palestine in the following November, much to the relief of Conder. The following is an extract from a letter written by Conder to Walter Besant, who was the Honorary Secretary of the PEF, in which his enthusiasm for the arrival of his chum is very evident. He writes, "We are all well and jolly, and I hope to go to Beersheba and come back again in time to go up to Jerusalem to meet Kitchener. How do you like him, by the by? He is a good companion, but not a beauty." At first, Conder and Kitchener got on extremely well. When Conder was seriously wounded at Safed, it was Kitchener who pulled him to safety, certainly saving his life. Conder naturally felt a huge debt of gratitude towards him and later defended his friend to the PEF when they wanted to end his employment. Unfortunately, the good relations between them were not to last. Conder was not a typical army man, but aspired to be many things, including a scholar, an artist, and one gets the distinct impression, a dashing heartthrob. Kitchener, however, was much more focused on a strictly military career. Whilst he had a genuine interest in the intellectual aims of the survey, he was more inclined to stick to his orders than was Conder. No deviations beyond recording and describing here. The work he carried out was consummately professional, but perhaps with less of the infectious enthusiasm for the subject matter than one encounters in Conder's reports. Having said that, he made few errors of interpretation because he did not interpret very frequently and was obviously a shrewd and intelligent observer. Charles Wilson, by this time a senior army man and a respected scholar, was very appreciative of Kitchener's intelligent, matter-of-fact, and to-the-point reports, as compared with those written by Conder, which were comparably accurate in their fundamentals, but which frequently included speculative and sometimes dubious interpretations. After the Safed incident, the survey party, having successfully mapped 4,400 square miles, began work on the publication of the results, which both Conder and Kitchener authored. However, after the Safed affair was finally concluded in 1877, Kitchener was sent out to finish the fieldwork, whilst Conder was left in London to continue working on the publication. It would appear that the injuries he sustained at Safed still caused him a great deal of difficulty. Conder was aggrieved. He felt that after all the hard work he had put in, he was being passed over for a younger, more ambitious, but less experienced man and left on the shelf. In addition, Conder felt that Kitchener was taking credit for work that he had done. In a hastily scribbled note written on the back of a previous correspondence, he writes thus: "Dear Besant, to the best of my knowledge, I was the discoverer of Dil Bluff, even before Kitchener discovered the country. The identification is not mentioned in his reports, but I published it in 1876 in the second statement of our journal. I have no doubt that he bagged it from the list which I gave him without acknowledgement, as he has done in other cases." Oh dear. To add insult to injury, Kitchener's military career began to seriously take off. In a letter to Besant written in 1883, a year before the final publication of the survey, Kitchener's father has the following to say: "His commanding officer in the Egyptian cavalry was here last week, and he gave a flourishing account of Herbert as a light cavalry officer. I should not think it unlikely that other engineers might not object to cast a stone at him. You see, he has gone right out of their groove." In the final analysis, whatever the opinion of his peers and of the committee and the officers in the PEF in London, the survey of Western Palestine was primarily Conder's great achievement. The accuracy of the mapping and the complex detail of the work have made it an invaluable tool for a wide range of scholars and researchers. Particularly interesting is the way in which it has increasingly become the primary source for information regarding population and land use in Palestine west of the Jordan River in the late Ottoman Empire. In this talk, I have concentrated on the first 3 expeditions which served as the basis for all subsequent archaeological and geographic work in the region, and upon which the reputation of the PEF as the pioneering organization in this field was based. So what became of our explorers after they so altruistically risked their lives for the PEF, England and St. George, and the pursuit of knowledge? Charles Wilson remained an active member of the PEF, though he never conducted any survey work on its behalf after his reconnaissance survey in 1865. In his military career, he is most remembered for discovering the fate of General Gordon at Khartoum and establishing the Geographical Intelligence Unit, now known as MI6. He died Major General Sir Charles Wilson in 1905 while serving as chairman of the PEF. Charles Warren never worked in the field for the PEF after his Jerusalem adventures. You could kind of twig a pattern here. Once is enough. Though like Wilson, he remained actively involved in the organization until his death in 1927. The rivalry between these two men had often resulted in the making or breaking of their various academic proteges in the later history of the fund. Warren served for many years in Southern Africa, most famously in the Boer War, as well as being commander at Singapore and at the Royal Engineers headquarters at Chatham. From 1886 to 1888, he was Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, a period which saw Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee and, most notorious of all Victorian crime cases, the Whitechapel or Jack the Ripper murders. Horatio Herbert Kitchener, who eventually became Field Marshal, Earl and ruler of Sudan, amongst other things, is not unsurprisingly better known for his army exploits. After the survey of Western Palestine, he also took part in the Fund survey of the Wadi Araba in 1883 to 84. At this point, his involvement with the PEF was less formal. After this point, he continued to stay in touch with Sergeant Armstrong and Walter Besant, and we have a small collection of personal letters from him. However, he did not, unlike Wilson and Warren, stay directly involved with the PEF and its work. This changed in 1913 when he was instrumental in the commissioning of the PEF to undertake the survey of the last corner of the Western Levant that had not been mapped and crucially bordered on the British-held Sinai. Kitchener knew that the PEF's expertise, what they had mapped up to at that point, and what remained unmapped. The PEF, with its long reputation of academic survey in the region, was to apply for a firman from the Ottoman administration for an archaeological survey. This they received, and the archaeological survey of the wilderness of Zin was carried out in 6 weeks by 2 young archaeologists, Leonard Woolley and T.E. Lawrence. However, the real purpose of the survey was military, with the archaeological survey acting as cover. The serious business of conducting the military survey was undertaken at the same time by a team of Royal Engineers, led by Captain Stuart Francis Newcomb, who reported directly to Kitchener. The resulting map of the Negev is undoubtedly what made this daringly successful Beersheba campaign possible. The survey was also instrumental in introducing the young T.E. Lawrence to the southern Levant, an area in which he would find fame as Lawrence of Arabia, and for introducing him to the man who would become his commanding officer in the field, by then Colonel Newcomb. Lord Kitchener was killed in 1916 in the Atlantic when his boat, the Hampshire, was struck by a mine laid by a German submarine. And there we have him, I think rendered brilliantly. I wish I knew who did the cartoon. And lastly, what about Claude Rainier Conde? In the early 1880s, he conducted a survey for the PEF east of the River Jordan in the area around Amman and Kerak, which was published in later editions of the Survey of Western Palestine. This was cut short when the firman granted by Constantinople was withdrawn because of security issues. At this time, Transjordan was a lawless and dangerous place for the Western traveller, and a place where the Ottoman administration had lost all real control. Conde received 2 honorary doctorates in law, the second from Edinburgh University in 1891. He penned countless articles for the PEF Quarterly Statement and wrote over 15 books, including the hugely successful Tent Work in Palestine, published in 1879, which was a popular account of the survey of Western Palestine. As with Wilson and Warren, Conde served on the committee of the PEF until his death in 1910. The contribution of these men to our knowledge of the history and archaeology of the Levant is monumental. As individuals, their achievements were phenomenal, but when combined under the umbrella of the Palestine Exploration Fund, they represent a unique contribution, a unique collective achievement, which effectively transformed our knowledge and appreciation of the region and provided a solid foundation of reliable information on which successive explorers and academics of all nationalities and disciplines are able to draw and build on. Quite simply, the PEF, with the talents of men like Wilson, Warren, Conde, and Kitchener, and the teams they led, is responsible for opening the eyes of the Western world to the heritage of the Levant. Whether we, the archaeologists, historians, biblical and textual scholars, and indeed just interested tourists and residents have always looked in the right way or with the right eyes is of course another matter, and one which is a primary concern today as conflicting ideologies all try and claim ownership of the past and indeed the present for their own ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Very good. Are you in a position to take any questions now?
Yes. By all means.
So would it perhaps be easier if you stop